The history of life on Earth is defined by noise, but its next chapter began with a profound, terrifying sigh. In the first 48 hours after the last human breath was drawn, the world underwent a violent mechanical death. Across the globe, the monumental webs of coal and copper we called power grids began to shudder. Without the constant vigilance of engineers to balance the load, fossil fuel plants ran dry. The massive turbines, the beating hearts of our civilization, groaned under the friction of their own weight before seizing into a permanent, rusted stillness. London, Tokyo, and New York were swallowed by a darkness they hadn't known for centuries. The stars, long obscured by the orange haze of light pollution, reclaimed the sky above the empty streets. The silence was not absolute. It was punctuated by the sound of our failures. Beneath the pavement, the water table began its patient assault. Without the electric pumps working 24/7 to keep the tunnels dry, the subways of the world transformed into subterranean rivers. Millions of gallons of brackish water flooded the arteries of our transit systems, corroding steel tracks and rotting the electrical veins of the city. Above ground, the thermal expansion and contraction of skyscraper windows caused them to shatter, raining crystalline shards onto the silent taxis below. This was the birth of the Shadows Archive, the moment history stopped being written and evolution began to experiment in the dark. The second chapter of the Shadows Archive is written in the language of gravity and rot. 10 years into the silence, the icons of human arrogance began to surrender. Without the constant application of protective paints and anti-corrosive chemicals, the steel skeletons of our world began to oxidize. The Eiffel Tower, once a shimmering monument of light, transformed into a red, flaking ghost. Across the Atlantic, the great suspension bridges of San Francisco and New York groaned under the weight of their own rust. The massive cables designed to withstand the tension of millions of vehicles began to snap with the sound of cannon fire, plunging tons of asphalt into the churning currents below. The skyscrapers, those needles of glass and hubris, became vertical ecosystem. Without the hum of air conditioning, the internal temperatures reached levels that shattered the remaining seals. Rain and snow began to fall inside the boardrooms of CEOs, turning expensive carpets into mossy bogs. In the upper floors, hawks and eagles made their nests in the hollowed-out offices, using the height of our ambition as their new hunting grounds. The concrete itself, which we thought was eternal, proved to be fragile. The rebar inside the pillars began to expand as it rusted, cracking the stone from the inside out. Our cities were no longer bastions of order. They were the hollowed-out skeletons of a fallen giant, slowly collapsing under the patient weight of time. Our legacy was not just built of steel and stone. It was forged in a volatile chemistry that the Earth was now forced to digest. By the 20-year mark, the most dangerous monuments of humanity began to leak. Thousands of nuclear power plants, once the symbols of our mastery over the atom, stood as silent ticking clocks. As the backup generators failed and the cooling ponds finally evaporated, the spent fuel rods were exposed to the air. Invisible fires of radiation stained the atmosphere, creating localized exclusion zones where life was forced to mutate or perish. But the poisoning was not limited to the atom. Millions of tons of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers stored in silos across the heartlands began to seep into the groundwater. These growth chemicals created grotesque localized explosions of mutated vegetation. Algae blooms in the stagnant rivers turned the water into a toxic, neon green soup, suffocating the aquatic life that had only just begun to recover. The chemical ghost of humanity haunted the soil, creating a strange, vibrant landscape of poisonous beauty. Plastic, our most enduring creation, began its long journey of breaking down into microscopic fragments, entering the very marrow of the new world. We left behind a planet that was fundamentally altered, a world where biology had to learn to feed on the toxic leftovers of a vanished master. Domesticated life was the first to face the trial of the void. We forget that we spent 10,000 years molding animals into our image, docile, dependent, and soft. For millions of pets trapped inside suburban homes, the first months were a slow horror of starvation. But for those that escaped into the silence, a brutal and swift metamorphosis began. The golden retriever, once a symbol of domestic peace, found the ancient ghost of the wolf stirring in its marrow. Survival is not a choice, It is a primal reflex that we could never fully erase. Within years, the first packs began to form in the ruins of shopping malls and abandoned schools. Their barks echoed through empty food courts as they learned to hunt the only prey left, the descendants of our livestock and each other. The pet was a human construct that died with us. What remained were creatures of pure instinct, relearning the hierarchy of the wild in the shadows of our playgrounds. Cats, too, returned to their ancestral roots, becoming stealthy predators that haunted the overgrown suburbs, hunting the birds that now nested in our chimneys. The great culling spared no one who could not adapt. The animals that thrived were not the ones we loved, but the ones that remembered how to kill. Nature is not a gentle mother. She is a relentless opportunist, waiting for a single crack in the armor. By the 50th year, the Green Reconquest had completely erased the boundaries of our civilization. Asphalt highways, designed to withstand the weight of millions of cars, buckled under the hydraulic pressure of a single seed. The tree of heaven, a resilient and aggressive colonizer, sprouted through the cracks in the concrete, acting like slow-motion dynamite to dismantle our infrastructure from within. The gray world of man was being digested, leaf by leaf. Ivy climbed the facades of glass towers, its micro-roots acting like acid, eating into the mortar and stone, until the walls themselves began to sag under the weight of the greenery. Central Park in New York was no longer a rectangle of managed nature. It was the heart of a new wild forest that was rapidly swallowing Manhattan. The concrete canyons became damp, shaded valleys where mosses and ferns thrived in the perpetual gloom. Our roads became rivers of grass, and our parking lots became meadows of wildflowers that no human eye would ever appreciate. The planet was exhaling, scrubbing the atmosphere of our carbon and reclaiming the soil we had paved over. The earth was finally whole again, and we were nothing more than a nutrient in the ground. The sea, the true owner of the earth, began its final reclamation of the coasts as the centuries passed. Without the constant maintenance of levees, dams, and seawalls, the boundaries we drew in the sand vanished. Cities like Miami, Amsterdam, and Venice were the first to be surrendered to the rising tides. The glass and steel of our skyscrapers became the foundations for new, strange coral reefs. Tropical fish swam through the submerged offices of CEOs, and sharks patrolled the halls of flooded museums, their shadows gliding over the remains of our art. The saltwater, a relentless corrosive agent, accelerated the collapse of the coastal megacities. Foundations were undermined by the tides, and the salt air ate through the last remnants of exposed metal. Our maritime history, from the great ports to the luxury liners, was buried under layers of silt and calcium. The ocean did not just drown our cities, it recycled them. The plastic we dumped for decades began to be incorporated into the nests of deep-sea creatures, and the sunken hulls of our ships became the nurseries for a new generation of marine life. The Blue Archive was growing, a silent record of humanity's failure to respect the power of the water. As the cities crumbled and the noise of industry became a distant memory, the boundaries between the urban and the wild disappeared entirely. Species that were once on the brink of extinction reclaimed the ruins of their ancestors. Large predators, lions, bears, and wolves, migrated into the hearts of former capitals, using the concrete canyons of Chicago and Berlin as their new hunting grounds. The air, now stripped of industrial smog and the haze of aviation, reached a level of clarity not seen since the dawn of the species. The planet had effectively erased the scar of the Industrial Revolution, replacing the hum of machinery with the ancient raw symphony of the wilderness. Forests grew through the roofs of abandoned stadiums, and herds of deer grazed on the lawns of parliaments. In this new world, the animals were no longer wild because there was no civilized world to compare them to. They were simply the occupants of a planet that had returned to its natural state. The silence was now filled with the calls of birds that had not been heard in centuries, and the night was lit only by the cold fire of the moon and the bioluminescence of fungi growing on the rot of our homes. Without the artificial warming of the human machine, the Earth's climate began to settle into its natural long-term rhythms. Thousands of years into the silence, the planet entered a period of stabilization, and then a slow cooling. The great cities of the North, already crushed by the weight of time, were now buried under the slow, unstoppable advance of glaciers. The steel of the Empire State Building and the stone of the Kremlin or ground into dust by the shifting ice. This was the Earth's way of cleaning the slate. The ice sheets acted as a massive planetary eraser, smoothing over the scars of our minds and the craters of our wars. In the south, the deserts bloomed as the weather patterns shifted without the interference of our carbon emissions. The Sahara began to turn green again, its ancient aquifers feeding a new savanna where strange, evolved mammals roamed. The planet was no longer reacting to us. It was following its own ancient cycles of ice and fire, oblivious to the fact that a species called humanity had ever tried to control the temperature of the world. The archive was now being written in the ice cores and the shifting sands. 5,000 years into the future, the Shadows Archive records the first true leaps in evolution. The descendants of our domesticated animals and the survivors of the great culling have evolved into entirely new species, unrecognizable from the creatures we once knew. Rats, having thrived in the labyrinth of our crumbling megastructures, have grown in size and developed complex social structures to navigate the vertical ruins. In the dark, damp corners of the world, new forms of bioluminescent flora have emerged, feeding on the strange mineral deposits left behind by our buried landfills and chemical waste. These plants glow with a sickly, beautiful light, illuminating the caves of plastic and glass that were once our basements. Life is no longer recovering from humanity. It has moved on, creating a world where we are not even a myth. New predators have emerged, specialized in hunting through the rusted skeletons of our towers, their limbs adapted for climbing steel and glass. The genetic legacy we left behind, the mutations from our radiation and the chemicals in our soil, has become the foundation for a bizarre and vibrant ecosystem. The shadows are no longer empty. They are teeming with a life that has forgotten the sun of the human era. 1 million years later, the archive is nearly complete. Almost everything we ever built, everything we ever loved, and everything we ever fought for has returned to the dust. The great monuments are gone. The mountains of trash have been subducted into the Earth's mantle or buried under miles of sediment. To a future intelligence visiting this planet, we would be nothing more than a momentary anomaly, a thin, strange layer of plastic, gold, and odd isotopes in the geological strata. The Earth has moved into a new era of breathtaking beauty, one that does not require our eyes to see it or our minds to name it. The silence is final, and the shadows are at peace. The only thing that remains of us is a faint isotopic signature in the rocks, a silent testimony that once, for a brief flicker of geological time, a species dared to think they owned the world. The archive is closed. The Earth is at last truly wild again.